Partial funding for GlobeWatch travel is provided by Gordon Smith III and the Children's Museum About the World, located in Raleigh, North Carolina, dedicated to global education.
When Singapore became an independent nation in 1965, the odds for its survival were slim. For nearly 170 years, a colony in the British Empire, the tiny island had little experience in self-determination. Today, Singapore is one of the most prosperous countries in the world, a success story that few would have predicted. In 30 years, the nation has built a modern and wealthy society with little poverty, homelessness, unemployment, or crime. Some would call it a miracle, but it's more than that. There was a plan, a grand design, one that might be followed today by other countries struggling to pull themselves out of chaos and poverty. I'm Jim Leutze. Join me for GlobeWatch. With about 250 square miles, Singapore is the smallest nation in Southeast Asia. At one time covered with tropical rainforest, the island republic is now an urban jungle, a vast city of highways and skyscrapers. Unlike its neighboring countries, Singapore has no petroleum, exotic woods, or precious metals to export. Instead, it's earned its way as a warehouse, a nation of middlemen, since Britain made it a colony in 1825. Now an independent city-state, Singapore's greatest asset is as a strategic juncture between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. What Singapore lacks in natural resources, it makes up for in location, planning, and hard work. This is the nation's port, which annually vies with Hong Kong and Rotterdam for the title of world's busiest. Singapore is now rich as a critical link in global commerce. More than 100 million tons of cargo come across these docks every year, and every conceivable product, from high-tech components to exotic birds. The cargo is worth nearly $50 billion, a quarter of it destined for Singapore's biggest market, the United States.
We have no mountains of gold or uranium, no great fishing grounds, no great prairie areas to cultivate. I mean, we have only ourselves, and there's no free lunch, so there are no gimmicks. You don't work, you starve. I mean, that's that. Yes, someone else can help you, but he too must make a living. So there's a certain practical approach towards organizing a society and towards life in general. And for various reasons, old-fashioned values are coming back into vogue in various parts of the world. And so they said, well, Singapore is an interesting place to study. But it's not because we have produced any really original ideas, but simply because we have kept to old-fashioned values of thrift, of hard work, of education, and so on.
The man responsible for turning those old-fashioned values into something tangible is Lee Kuan Yew. a Chinese Singaporean educated in England. When Britain granted Singapore internal self-government in 1959, Lee was elected Prime Minister. He set out to transform what was then an economic backwater into a competitive, industrialized nation. He turned to the United Nations and a team of European economists whose recommendations would turn the country upside down. At the time, the majority of the population was uneducated, sick, and living in hovels, hardly ready for Lee's ambitious nation building. Despite these obstacles, Lee decided to follow the Japanese model and turn Singapore into a huge factory, since the only natural resource was labor. But the challenges were many. Lee had to not only train the workers, he had to create the jobs as well. Creating jobs meant attracting foreign businesses that would hire and train Singapore's unskilled labor force. But those businesses would only come if there were a stable political and social environment. A major challenge, since Singapore had been plagued with economic and ethnic tensions since the end of World War II. The strategy was called nation building, and it featured two basic but critical social policies.
One was housing the people. We have a very good and strong public housing program. Housing in Singapore, public housing, was the equivalent of land reform. It was a redistribution. It's the political equivalent of land reform in an urban society. And secondly, we emphasized education. Now, once you've educated a population, the population are trainable, they follow logic, and they understand you, and they aspire to new goals and vision.
Lee would tolerate no political dissension, strikes, or corruption. His political organization, the People's Action Party, monopolized the young nation's politics, and opponents were censored or imprisoned. Under Lee's leadership, Singapore aggressively pursued law, order, and prosperity with a national and international agenda.
They had to take measures which curbed the trade unions and prevented the riots and strikes which were so much a feature of Singapore in the 1950s and early 60s. And all this was to make Singapore more attractive to the multinational companies.
Lee Kuan Yew went to the United States to try to get US investors to come to Singapore, this tiny island state which is independent, to invest. And we went to Africa, we went to the Middle East, we went everywhere to sell Singapore, and we brought in the investors.
Though elected, Lee's rule seemed to many observers more authoritarian than democratic. He ran the country like a private corporation, tightly managing every phase of its development. Only certain industries were allowed to grow through tax breaks and incentives. Others were left to struggle on their own.
I would say that 1965, or independence, was really a very important time, because that really meant that we had to rely on our own resources for economic growth and for everything else. It was because of that, and in many ways because of the sense that the two pillars of the economy were actually not going to remain pillars anymore, that there was a deliberate strategy to turn towards export-oriented industrialization.
Industry and manufacturing, for which nothing in Singapore's history had prepared it. The other thing was, as a service center and a financial center, again, nothing in Singapore's history had provided for this new experience. So we had to build an industrial park or parks and bring in the multinationals, start the business schools, the engineering departments in the universities in order to get the technical manpower to fuel the manufacturing industrial base that Singapore must now erect.
Lee promised Singaporeans great material rewards if they would follow his revolutionary plan, and they did. With a primarily Confucian ethic that preaches hard work and sacrifice of individual freedom to the community, the ambitious island began its ascent into prosperity and peace. Today, Singapore's per capita income has reached the level of several Western European countries. At least 200 foreign banks have offices in Singapore, and thousands of multinational corporations fill the city's skyscrapers. Entire blocks are devoted to indoor shopping malls where American fast food may be featured alongside expensive Swiss watches. Historically, Singapore has depended upon its port for its contact with the outside world. Without trade, Singapore had no economy. Today, in addition to its busy harbor, Singapore has the sprawling Changi Airport complex, one of the cleanest and most efficient in the world. Changi and Singapore Airlines, which calls this airport home, embody the principles that have made this tiny nation such an enormous success. The airport and the airlines are owned by the government under Singapore's unique brand of modified capitalism, in which certain major industries are run by the state. Recent history has shown that in most cases, nationally owned businesses are managed poorly and would be better left to the private sector. But Singapore and its airline are an exception. Like the government, Singapore Air is run with a level of efficiency and attention to detail rarely attributed to bureaucracies, making it one of the top airlines in the world.
Take, for example, the human resource, which is our country's only natural resource. Well, the government takes developing the skills of the national workforce very seriously, just as we take development of our own employees very seriously. Financial management, the government has balances the national budget every year. That's prudent financial management. And we run our finances the same way. And also the country is export-oriented, which means we must always keep in mind the customer. Our product and our service must always be of the highest quality.
Like the nation itself, Singapore Air started with few resources other than personnel. Founded in 1972, the airline faced tough international competition, especially from the Japanese and Europeans. But careful planning has meant a profit every year. In 1991, the airline had a $4 billion surplus. The same year, many American carriers found themselves in deep financial trouble. In 1992, Singapore Air surprised a recession-weary world with plans to nearly double its fleet by the year 2000, in anticipation of a better global economy and increased focus on the Asia-Pacific region. To distinguish itself from its many competitors, Singapore Air took a basic business concept, adding value, and applied it to air travel, making top in-flight service a trademark.
Our airport is considered to be a favorite airport among many visitors. But we have resolved that we should not be complacent. We should move on in order to achieve our vision of the future. And therefore, there will be further investment in making the port better, bigger, smarter, through the use of technology, including information technology. And in the road transportation area, there will be more highway. We are thinking of a more underground highway so that we'll be able to release more land for the other developmental needs of Singapore. So this is a never-ending sort of arrangement in order to make Singapore a much better place for global business.
We have a 5.5-day week. We work half day on Saturdays, and even then, I mean, during weekdays, I think we work mighty long hours as well. So we all have to work hard, we have to keep on our toes, and that happens, I think, from the moment you enter school right up to, I think, the day you retire. That's one of the prices, I think, that we have to pay. I think the other is the fact that in the process of trying to build a nation virtually from scratch, that we are a highly regulated society.
Despite appearances, this is a subway station, not an art gallery. Some wag has suggested that Singapore is a fine city. There's a fine for this and a fine for that. It's my own impression that the restrictive nature of these policies has been exaggerated. I don't think the people of Singapore don't throw litter on the street and don't spit and now don't chew chewing gum because they're afraid of being fined, but rather because they think it's a good idea. Moreover, they're an orderly people. I don't think they're lurking behind trees waiting to throw trash on the ground or sneaking home in order to spit. The result is a remarkably clean city and a subway station that looks like this.
Okay, littering. There is a fine if you litter. But at the end of the day, Singapore's streets are clean. Not just because there's that deterrent fine. I think people have been socialized. This is the socialization dimension of politics. Being socialized about having a clean city, a clean place, and this become an important part of the chemistry of Singaporeans.
We try not to be a seedy, sleazy city which may be of particular interest to tourists and visitors. We take the position that this is home. And we are a compact society. It's the only city we have. We keep it orderly, we keep it clean, we keep it tidy and organized and convenient.
Perhaps the most critical link in Singapore's success is its emphasis on education, leading to a remarkably high rate of literacy, nearing 90% of the population. The schools focus on training future employees for the country's economic machine. At least 2/3 of the workforce is in the service or technical professions. Competition starts as soon as the students get to school.
They're pragmatic, and the way up in the society is very much connected to the paper chase. You get your degree, you get your A-levels, and you make money. And if you don't, you simply won't make money. It's that simple. So there's a lot of competition for the places in the university. There's a lot of competition, particularly in the professions like medicine and law. And every student here, in a way, it's like the American dream. Every student wants to be on top and wants to earn his way to the top. And the way you do that is by working hard in school. There's really no other way.
If you ask anyone in this college, everyone expects to go to the university. Everyone expects to get a good grade. It's not enough to get 2 A's and 2 A-level passes and 2 O-level passes. You've got to do better than that. So it's just this thing to keep up with whatever's going on. You know, if your peers are going to get 3 A's and a B, how can you settle for 2 E's and an O, you know?
There are 2 reactions to Singapore that are almost required. The first, amazement at what they've accomplished. The second, dissatisfaction that the government is not more open to dissent. The signs of progress and modernity are all around you. At the same time, there's a climate of government restraint. Or, as one interviewee said, a perception that there is a climate of fear. The question that almost hangs in the air is how much freedom could be allowed before progress was compromised. In the past, Lee has used such heavy-handed measures as strict media censorship and police crackdowns against alleged communist conspirators. But without such controls, said the government, Singapore's prosperity would disintegrate. This question opens the debate as to what Singapore's citizens may have had to sacrifice for its clean, safe streets and busy offices.
I think a Western observer of the Singapore scene would ask us, is the price that of liberty? Because there seems to be conformity, the system requires a high degree of compliance. I would say yes, you know, there is a high degree of compliance, but when you're in a different cultural milieu and social culture, what you consider compliance is solidarity and cohesion, and there is a certain satisfaction in being cohesive. So is it a price?
The voters, I think, while some of them may recognize the need for an opposition, just want there to be more alternative voices in Parliament, don't also realize that they don't want to risk losing what Singapore has. So they might give their votes to some opposition candidates, but if there's any danger that an opposition party is going to win, I don't think Singaporeans will give that party the votes.
Lee Kuan Yew is no longer Prime Minister, having passed on the top position to a successor, Goh Chok Tong, who has begun to ease some of the government's authority. At the same time, there are signs that the People's Action Party is losing its grip on the electorate. A recent election gave the opposition several new seats in the parliament. Another sign of change. Some Singaporeans have now begun to relax, enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work.
I think there's concern in Singapore that might Singaporeans be getting complacent, having got there. And we are seeing it. I'm seeing it amongst my friends. I mean, maybe I'm seeing it myself too. You begin to ask, okay, do I want to push so much more? Do I want to work 12 hours, 13 hours a day or something, you know? Do I want to not drop out, but do I want to make more time for myself, my family? And these are issues which you have amongst so-called yuppies anywhere.
If we become complacent, then we become fat and lazy, and we stop making the effort, then others will catch up and we'll be left behind, and we will have nothing to fall back on. It is not that we manufacture an artificial sense of insecurity. I think it is in the very nature of our existence.
It's a small country. After all, we're only the size of Brooklyn, or the city of Chicago, the borough of Brooklyn, you know, in New York. So that's what you have to think of, or the city of Chicago. Now we're going to survive in this world which is increasingly rather difficult, and there's a hostile economic environment. So that will always keep us on our toes.
I think the Singapore product is Singapore. I think this island is the center, in a sense, of this part of the world. I think it has created a kind of environment where trade can happen, a certain amount of order, and a tremendously strong set of human resources. I think that's the product here. I think that's what Singapore really is. I think 50 years from now it may be something very different and very Singaporean. It's a little perhaps like Venice was at one time, or New York was at one time. Maybe New York still is. The great product of New York is New York. The great product of Singapore may be Singapore.
So Singapore has achieved a great deal. But what's next? It should come as no surprise that the Singaporeans have produced a blueprint for the future that includes more emphasis on the arts, whole new planned communities, and raising the per capita income to equal that of the United States. It's called the next lap.
Lee Kuan Yew and the first generation of nationalists delivered independence. They built a social contract with the people. And in a sense, you know, compliance came in and they were more accepting of what the nationalist leaders say. The next generation of leaders, the successors to Lee Kuan Yew, will have to talk much better to persuade the population and come up with new things to persuade them that they should give the same degree of trust. So governance is going to be, and winning the votes will be a little harder. And I think we have to work through this transition to find our equilibrium in moving from a society that's developing to a fully developed society.
Singapore began life a little more than 170 years ago as a free port within the British Empire. Today, it's an international marketplace. From a mixture of races and cultures, Singapore has fashioned a secular, pragmatic, materialistic society. Its people enjoy one of the highest per capita incomes in all of Southeast Asia, in part because of a government and an economy that's as tightly run as the corporations whose offices form the skyline of the modern city. In Western eyes, Singapore may seem to be lacking in our traditional ideas of participatory democracy. But perhaps we shouldn't judge the nation by this standard. Singapore certainly has achieved a strong sense of community and a commitment to common goals. This is something the Western world could learn with its fractured societies and troubled economies.
Partial funding for GlobeWatch travel is provided by Gordon Smith III and the Children's Museum About the World, located in Raleigh, North Carolina, dedicated to global education.